Hi, I'm Judy Kim. I'm now a postdoc at Yale, but I'll be presenting things I worked on during my PhD at Hopkins with my advisor, Marina Bedney. This workshop has been really interesting, so I want to thank Gary for inviting me. Oops. So the big question that this work asks really is, how do we know what we know? And one challenge in answering that question is that we learn about the world through a variety of different ways that are typically confounded. They're all there at the same time. For example, you might know that some bananas are purple, but do you remember how you first learned that? Maybe you saw a purple banana with your own eyes, or someone might have told you using words, some bananas are purple. And sometimes we gain information also just by thinking. You could infer, for example, that purple and yellow bananas are different species of bananas and possibly have different causal origins. And then in certain societies like ours, we additionally learn a lot through formal education as well. And studying what people born blind know then can tell us much about how you might learn when one of these sources, so vision, isn't available, but the others are. And so today I'm gonna zip through only 2 of these studies we've run looking at congenitally blind individuals' knowledge about the appearance and color of objects. And of course, the question of interest to everyone here today is, what's the role of language and how this knowledge is acquired? And relatedly, but also kind of differently, how could all this be, in principle, learned through language alone? And unfortunately, I think I raise as opposed to answer more questions about the role of language. But one big picture point I want to make from the start is that to the extent that we have asked any questions about language, I think it's been directed at one particular kind, this one, which is kind of associative knowledge about what specific real objects in the world look like, knowing that bananas are yellow. But I want to tell you that what we find is blind and sighted people share a lot of other much deeper kinds of knowledge about the so-called visual world, like knowing why bananas can be yellow, as well as why people say things like bananas are yellow, or understanding what the quality of yellowness is. And I think we haven't even started to ask what the contribution of language is for these cases. And so that's, to me, the exciting work for the future. And so with that in mind, I'm going to jump into data. First, participants. We have slightly different groups across studies, but they're all congenitally blind, so blind since birth, and people are screened, so they have no prior experiences of shape, color, or motion. And we always have age and education matched control sighted participants. In this first study, we asked, how much do blind people know about what things look like? And we probed knowledge about appearance of common animals as a case study. In one task, people sorted little cards with animal names written on them, and they sorted these in separate rounds for different properties, so shape, skin texture, and color. And here I'm going to show you blind and sighted people's similarity matrices generated from this card sorting task. First, what we found was that for shape and texture, blind and sighted people sort animals in a fairly similar way. You can see here there are similar clusters of animals. But then, somewhat surprisingly for us, for color, blind people's responses looked really different from the sighted. As again, you can eyeball here, although of course we had analyses to quantify what I just said. So the next question then was, why is this? Why do blind people have less consistent knowledge about animal color? Well, one thought we had was maybe animal color is just hard to describe. That is, maybe blind people don't learn color because sighted people are bad at communicating what they can perceive. But it turns out that's actually not true. When we asked sighted people to describe animal color in this task, they were in fact very consistent and coherent, and more so than for shape and texture. So what we argued in our paper is that blind people don't learn because sighted people can't describe color can't be the correct explanation. And in fact, we went as far as to say, maybe blind people don't learn about appearance by relying on what sighted people say, because if they do, then their color knowledge should be more consistent. But after the paper was published, people, including those in the audience today, wrote response letters to our paper, arguing that what's important is not asking whether sighted people can or can't describe color if you ask them to, but instead, it's about whether they do so at all in everyday language. And the letters, interestingly, show that if you look at just simple co-occurrence statistics or more sophisticated distributional info, like word embeddings like Adon talked about yesterday, it turns out object color is really not present in language. And want to add that at Cox's Eye, I saw Clara Berge and Ben Morris showing some cool data suggesting people mention atypical colors of objects, like saying black sheep, more than typical ones like white sheep. And this is interestingly true even when people are talking to young children. And I think these observations are right and important, and they're very interesting pieces of the puzzle. But I also want to pivot and tell you that looking just at possible language input doesn't explain everything about what blind people know or don't know. One thing we observed was that blind people sorting by color was actually different from those of the sighted, not in a completely random way, but there was some systematicity unique within the blind group. And what we realized was that blind people were sometimes sorting based on animals' taxonomic similarity when they were asked to sort by color. So here I'm showing that when you correlate animals' taxonomic similarity with these sorting results, for sighted people, there's no relation here, but then for blind people, there is. And if you think about it, going by which animals are taxonomically similar gives you some good information about shape and texture. You know, all mammals, for example, have 4 legs and have long oval bodies. But animal color kind of works in a funny way and it's complicated, so it doesn't work the same way. So you can have a set of white animals that don't share any other properties. And so in our paper, we argued blind people are trying to infer what things look like by relying on other things they know, like which animals are taxonomically similar. But because that doesn't work so well with color, it appears as if they have little knowledge about animal color. And color compared to shape or texture, in other words, is not known because color is hard to infer. In fact, in this next study, we wanted to probe more about what kinds of other inferences blind people might be able to make about color and ask, can we tell from their inferences whether they have any deeper knowledge about the causes of color? And we asked this by asking people to make judgments about color consistency across instances of the same objects. If I asked you what's a common color of a strawberry or a car or stop sign, you can answer for all of these red, right? But you can also answer this other question of how likely do you think it is that 2 strawberries are the same color, or 2 cars, or how about 2 stop signs? And you could probably answer, everyone in the audience, that for strawberries, it's very likely, not likely for car, but very likely, again, for stop signs. And so how do you know this? Well, one way we might learn it, perhaps, is by tracking the actual distribution of color frequencies for an object. Most strawberries you've seen in your life have been red, so you could infer that 2 hypothetical strawberries are going to have the same color too. But now, before I told you that blind individuals don't seem to learn easily describable things like that strawberries are red. And so you might predict they don't have knowledge about consistency either. But there's also an alternative scenario in which you could infer based on knowing about what kind of a thing an object is. Like knowing that strawberries are natural kinds might give you info that, well, they probably share DNA, so they're likely to have the same color. You could think cars are artifacts, and artifact color varies by personal preference, so 2 cars are likely to be different colors. Sometimes artifacts like stop signs need to be visible and recognized, so they're likely to be the same color. So you could in principle know these things without actually knowing that red is the actual color of many of these objects. And indeed, we first find replicating what we saw with the animals is that when just asked to name a common color of an object, blind people are much more variable compared to the sighted. So they don't consistently say bananas are yellow, or carrots are orange, pearls are white, or tables are brown, or tennis balls are yellow, but sighted people do. But then if you ask a second question to make an inference about how likely are 2 instances of the same object to be the same color, you just have to take my word for it here. Blind and sighted people make identical predictions across different object kinds and experiments with real and novel objects. And we also had we asked for explanations about why an object has the color that it does, and found that blind people have really detailed knowledge about the causes that often seem unlikely to have come from a sighted person telling them the explanation. Sighted people, for example, will say polar bears are white because they have to blend in with their Arctic environment. But half of our blind participants said, oh, I think polar bears are black because they live in the Arctic environment, but it's cold and dark colors absorb heat. And in fact, both of these answers are correct. Polar bears have black skin under their fur, but no sighted person ever mentioned black. And so based on these results, we've started arguing that blind people seem to have what we call intuitive theories of color that detail causal relationships between objects and their colors. They actively use this knowledge to make inferences and predictions and generate explanations that are as detailed and sophisticated as most sighted people's. And so what's the role of language and how people might acquire these theories? How are they acquired if blind people don't even learn simple things like that bananas are yellow? I don't really know. I think there are many possible directions to go with this, but just throwing out one idea, for example, maybe some of this knowledge actually doesn't require that much linguistic data. Imagine, for example, that you're a blind child and you occasionally hear statements like bananas are yellow, but then never cars are red. And you might not hear in code or maybe just forget that yellow was the specific color associated with a banana, but you could retain other kinds of knowledge. Like the generic construction in the sentence might clue you in that bananas have a consistent color. And then you might not even need to hear the same thing over and over again for other objects. You could generalize and say, oh, maybe other fruits or maybe even all natural kinds tend to have consistent colors. And I wanted to talk about these experiments, but I can't, so I'd be happy to talk about them offline if anyone's interested. But to summarize and conclude, I started by showing you that blind people acquire associative knowledge about what things look like rather inconsistently. And here, one language-related cause might be that sighted people don't talk about color in a way that makes it easy for blind people to learn that information. But I've also argued they do learn other things, like the relationship between objects and colors. And other work showed they understand how sighted people think and talk about color, and also understand things about color similarity and the perceptual space. And there are many questions left about how this knowledge is acquired. Many ways language might play a role, but I want to end by making a broader point, which I've sort of hinted throughout the talk, which is that we need to ask both what information is available in blind people's linguistic input, but I think it's also equally important to study what kinds of inferences they might make to go beyond whatever data they're given. And in the end, I think both of these components go under the umbrella of learning from language, but it's useful, I think, nonetheless, to think about these questions separately. So I want to thank my advisor, Marina, Julia, Ellie did a lot of the work too, and then Barbara Landau was kind of the inspiration for all of this work. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Judy. We have about 3 minutes for questions.
I got one. So bananas are often green and strawberries, as you showed, are green when young. And so it, you know, there's actually not, the generic language is complicated and rich in terms of how it works and what kinds of implications we should take from it. And it may well be that, you know, like birds lay eggs, right? Well, male birds don't lay eggs, baby birds don't lay eggs. All these things are like somehow much richer sort of relational and contextualized statements, right? And so this is sort of related to Vladimir's talk as well. I just like, I'm wondering, there's less of an appeal to a sort of a structured relational framing of what our knowledge about these things is about. Like Vladimir's talking about associations, and you're also talking more about associations, but you know, taxonomies are parts of theories about evolution, right? Some taxonomies are, for example, plant biological taxonomies are parts of theories of evolution. And we, you know, we can have a statement like, biologists used to think that these two trees were in the same genus, but they're not. They've decided that they're not based on DNA evidence. And this is a very complicated set of relational statements that's moving an item from a place in a tree to another place in a tree based on some evidence, right? And about DNA or something. So I'm just thinking language is so central to all of that. And your paper certainly triggers all those thoughts. But I just wanted to raise the question of why we're not more directly speaking about the relational content of all of these kinds of linguistic statements, as opposed to somehow thinking of it as an associative process.
I mean, I have two answers, and I love everything you said. And one thing I want to clarify is that I actually think what I'm saying goes against a purely associative account. That's like kind of what we're arguing against. In that it's true that I'm talking about structures, but I think in saying, that's why I framed it as intuitive theories or like causal structures, because I think it's not learned by forming associations. I'm going to like put the strong against Vladimir's account, that it's more about abstract relations between like causes and their effects that don't have to be grounded in specific examples. And I don't know if I agree that language is necessary to represent those things. We certainly communicate about them through language, but I think you can, kind of going back to what Don was saying, you can have that structure in thought, but I don't know to what extent language.
Yeah, I guess I would, but we very often find out about it through language, right? So how else would I find out that botanists had decided that some two species were no longer in the same genus, right? That they had decided to place them in two different genera, besides somebody telling me this with language.
I mean, so a lot of our experiments are aimed at answering questions indirect, like asking questions implicitly without asking people to explain, except we had explanations. But I also want to mention the first part of what you said about the generics, saying like bananas are yellow. And you're totally right. So philosophers have long talked about how there's no truth about object color, metaphysically speaking, because an apple can appear so many different colors depending on context, like who's viewing it. Do you have a human visual system and the lighting? So if you turn off the light, it's no longer red, but we think of it as being red. And so we actually, the third experiment we ran was asking people's intuitions about like, do you understand that color, for it to be perceived, it requires assumptions about all of these different conditions, including reviewer typical conditions and maybe even causal history. But that's one experiment that I'm really excited about. But you're right, it's like there's so much rich knowledge even in that one statement that I think we need to study.
Cool.
Could I ask briefly about your work on the similarity of the color space? So you didn't get to it in your talk. Can you just tell us briefly, are people making inferences? How are they doing it?
Yeah, in my experiment, people made judgments about naturalness of graded color adjectives. So saying bluer, like when can you say that? And blind and sighted people accept that you can say one blue is bluer than the other one. Another blue. So they accept that within blue, there's gradability. They don't think it's natural to say blue is bluer than red, but then sometimes when the colors are close enough, you can say blue is bluer than purple. And so there seems to be like really subtle knowledge that there are these similarity relations that's kind of unique to the color space.